next module is a very important topic in occupational safety and health. This is the hazard identification, risk assessment and control o tinatawag nating Hirac. Sa safety, napaka-importante po nito because this is the foundation of the occupational safety and health programs in your workplace. So what are our objectives for this topic? Number 1 is we should be able to discuss the importance and goal of risk assessment. Next is determine how to use the risk matrix and the risk ratings upon identifying hazards in the workplace. And lastly, recommend appropriate controls for the hazards identified. Before I begin my discussion, allow me to show you a picture. Okay, so found in your screen, no? May dalawa pong picture akong pinapakita. On your right is a picture of a little boy chewing a wire that is connected to a socket. On your left naman is a little girl who is handling or playing an unknown chemical that is found below the sink in their homes. No? So, if titingnan po natin ang mga pictures na ito, masasabi natin delikado ang ginagawa nila or mapapahamak ang mga batang ito. So, the question is, why do you think they are doing these unsafe actions? Do you think they have any sense of danger? The answer is wala. Experience-wise, they haven't experienced any danger in their life or they don't know because ang alam nila, the world is their playground and everything I see is my toy. No? So, these kids do not have any sense of danger. Now, let me relate this picture to the workplace. We do not want our workers will be like these little kids na para bang ang mundo ay ang kanilang workplace ay pinagtatrabahuan lang po nila. Trabaho lang. And not recognizing some of the dangers that is lurking around that can cause harm in their occupational safety or in their health. So, it is important that we recognize these hazards in the workplace. So, dito na po papasok ang tinatawag nating Hirac. So, what is Hirac? Hirac, or as we have said, this is your hazard identification, risk assessment, and control. So, this is the process of identifying your workplace hazards. This is both your safety hazards and your health hazards. Next is evaluating risks to workers' safety and health and control these relevant hazards. So, bakit importante ang pagkakaroon po ng risk assessment or yung Hirac? Number 1 is it creates awareness of hazards and risks. Napaka-importante po ito. So, tulad po nung sinabi ko po kanina with regard to those kids, no? Those kids do not have any idea that they are in danger. So, we do not want our workers to be the same. So, in this case, we want that they have a safety-first mindset in everything that they do. So, creating awareness of the hazards and risks is part, or why is it important for risk assessment? Number 2, identify who may be at risk. So, kailangan natin ma-identify kung sino po yung mga high-risk population ng ating workplace, such as the employees, sino pa ba, yung mga cleaners po natin, your stakeholders who may be visiting you, the visitors, your clients, the contractors, or even the public. Let me tell you about a story, no? Sa aking workplace before. There was one cleaner that we have na nagkaroon po ng infection yung kanyang kamay because he was not aware of the safety practices in the workplace or the practices that can protect him. So, even if they are not the frontliners in your workplace, kailangan bigyan din natin sila or pagtutuunan din po natin sila ng pansin with regard to risk assessment. Number 3, determine whether a control program is required for a particular hazard. Now, our workplaces may have different hazards, no? And our occupational safety and health programs must respond or must address these relevant hazards. Okay? So, dito po natin yan mahahanap when we create or formulate our Hirac. Kasi, ma-identify natin kung ano ang mga hazards, ano ang mga peligro na nakakasalamuhan ng ating mga workers in which they are exposed every day, no? 8 to 5 or kung in an 8-hour shift. Minsan, nag-overtime tayo, di ba? So, these hazards and risks are posing a threat to our workers. So, it's only right that we have programs that can respond to those threats. Next, determine if existing control measures are adequate or if more should be done. So, kailangan din po natin makita or ma-evaluate whether our programs are working. So, when our risks lessens, no, or magdi-decrease po doon sa na-identify natin na risk rating before, then it would safe to say na our control measures are working. So, but if we are still exposed to these hazards and it even increases our risk, then we may need more appropriate control measures to be in place. Next, prevent injuries or illnesses, especially when done at the design or planning stage. It is important na even if yung mga processes po natin ay dinidisenyo pa, even our workplace layout ay Alright, so when should a risk assessment be done? Number 1, before new processes or activities are introduced. So, bago po tayo maggawa or mag-implement ng bagong proseso or bagong activity, kailangan muna i-assess muna natin ang risk. Hirac muna para ma-anticipate natin kung ano yung hazards in the new activity to be introduced and give or implement the hazard controls. Number 2, before changes are introduced to existing processes. So, kanina, new processes, diba? Or activity. Dito naman, kung may babaguhin po tayo sa nakasanayang activity or process. So, that would include the products, the machinery, or any tools that are introduced into the process. And of course, lastly, if hazards ay identified. So, kung ano man itong hazards, diba, natutunan po natin. The occupational safety, the occupational health hazards, if they are identified, no, out of the blue, na nakasalamuhan ng ating mga workers, especially, for example, ngayon, pwedeng tag-ulan. So, they are new hazards with the weather conditions, but during also hot weathers, no, or the dry season. So, may hazards din po yan na ma-identify. So, it depends. So, again, before or new processes are introduced, before changes are introduced, and when hazards. So, let's start with hazard identification. No? So, ito yung HI ng ating Hirac. Ang proseso po natin dito ay ang pag-identify, finding, and identifying our hazardous agents, be it situation, people, or products, no, that could contribute to provoking of an occupational disease or accident. Okay? Then in this stage also, we will be identifying the high-risk groups, or ibig sabihin, these are the people who are potentially exposed to the hazards. Kasi in your whole company, in a different departments, no, they can be exposed to the different hazards uniquely. So, hindi porket ito po yung ma-identify sa isang department, it will be the same on another department. So, we'll see, no? We will be assessing that through hazard identification. Okay? So, where do you identify hazards from? We identify hazards from the work system: people, equipment, material, and environment. So, isa-isahin pa natin yan, no? Okay, so let's start with people. So, we will be asking questions, no? How do we identify hazards from people? So, if your people are untrained, are your people doing unsafe acts, then they can be the source of these hazards. Okay? Next is equipment. Are your equipment calibrated? Are your equipment up to date? No? Hindi ba siya kailangan ng mga updates? And if it's not updated, of course, posing po ito ng stress para sa ating mga tao. So they can be the source of your hazards. Let's check environment. Is your environment, no, up to its working condition? Kumbaga, favorable ba ang working condition para sa ating mga workers? Is it too warm in your environment? Is it too cold in your environment? Are the lights enough? No? Hindi ba sila na-expose in terms of air quality? Maganda ba ang indoor air quality? No? So, environment. The hazards may come from there. Next is the material. Although I know in your offices, it's not, you are not handling any hazardous materials, but what about your cleaning services? No? Those people who are engaged in that kind of job, or doing cleaning in your different utilities. No? Okay. So, in this identification of hazards, kailangan pagtuunan natin yung dalawa. Both the safety hazard and the health hazards should be identified. So, how do we conduct hazard identification? Unang-una, we can do a walkthrough or ocular inspection. Pagpasok mo pa lang sa ating workplace, tingnan mo ang paligid. Taas, baba, gilid, left and right. What are the hazards that I can be exposed to? So, for example, in an office setting, check the floor or yung ating wirings, whether are there tripping hazards, no, for unkempt wires. Next is it can be yung illumination. Tingnan po ang ating ceiling. If our fixtures are okay, wala po bang napunde na bulb that can influence the illumination level of our workplace, no? Or any wet floor na pwedeng mag-cause ng ating slipping hazard. Okay? So, that is an example. Mas maging aware tayo sa ating surroundings. Next is review of the processes involved. Ano po ba ang mga trabaho? Ano po ba in terms of my job that can threaten or put me at risk in an accident or an illness? So, i-review natin ano po yung mga trabaho po na ginagawa ng ating mga workers. Is this job requires me does this job requires me to sit for a long time that can cause me back pain? Pwede, no? Next is knowing the raw products or the raw material used in the products. So, alamin kung are we using any hazardous chemical, no? Especially kung yung mga para naman po ito sa mga workers natin na involved in the cleaning services. So, they can be exposed to. Next is gathering workers' complaints. Ano po ba ang mga complaints ng ating mga workers? No? Because they are the ones who are experiencing these risks, then they can have a significant or relevant complaints that is worth investigating for. And lastly, safety data sheet. Again, this is for your chemicals. Next is dito na po tayo sa risk assessment, no? Yung RA ng ating Hirac. This is determining the likelihood of harm, such as yung injury or illness, occurring and its severity. Ano po ba ang harm na ma-experience ko? Ano ang tsansa? So the main questions that you're going to be asking here is, ano ang tsansa na mangyari sa akin yung harm or the illness that can occur to me? And if ever mangyari man sa akin itong harm, gaano kalala ito? Okay? So, in this case, we will be looking at the probability of the harm happening to me, to the worker, and how severe will this harm be for me. Of course, each worker has a unique disposition, diba? In terms of gender, in terms of lifestyle. So, may iba't ibang risks po tayo, no? In even one worker. So, what is the severity of which? So, we will be looking at the risk rating for this. So, the risk is equal to the likelihood of the event and the consequences of the harm. Now, to aid us, no, para mas lalo maintindihan po natin ito, let's watch a very short video discussing on the severity, the likelihood, and the likelihood of this.
Hello and welcome to this video on risk. We're going to have a look at what risk is and take a look at how to use a risk matrix. First of all, what is risk? Now, if you think about it, life is full of risks. From the time we wake up to the time we go to sleep, and even in between. For example, there are risks associated with breathing. Did you know that air pollution causes about 7 million deaths each year? There are risks associated with eating. Foodborne illness causes about 420,000 deaths each year. And then there's traveling. Road accidents cause over 3,000 deaths each day. In fact, every day we have to make constant decisions about the risks we face. Now, there are situations in which we need to know what the risk is from certain events so that appropriate action can be taken. For example, what's the risk to health from a new influenza virus, an industrial chemical accident, or a bushfire? But first, what exactly is risk? Risk can mean different things to different people and in different contexts. But in very simple terms, risk can be thought of as the product of how likely someone is to be exposed to something bad, a hazard, and the consequence, which is how bad the outcome will be. Let's have a look at an example. Say you have to cross a road, and you're trying to figure out what the risk associated with this is. Let's take a look at some different scenarios. In the first scenario, our hazard is a bicycle. Let's assume there are only bicycles allowed on this road. Let's also assume that the road is not that busy, and there's only one bicycle every 5 minutes on that road. Now, because bicycles don't go on that road very often, the likelihood of the bicycle crashing into you is low, right? If the bicycle does crash into you, the consequence of that would be relatively low, wouldn't it? So in this scenario, the likelihood and the consequence are both low. Therefore, the overall risk is low. Now obviously, if there are bicycles traveling more frequently, the likelihood of a crash would be higher. But the consequence, if a bicycle did crash into you, would still be low. But what if things were different? Let's change that bicycle to a truck. Now with a truck passing every 5 minutes, the likelihood of a crash would still be low. However, the consequence is far more severe. Now, imagine if it was a busy truck route and trucks were going on this road very frequently. In this scenario, both the likelihood of a crash and the consequence will be high, which means that the overall risk would be high. you wouldn't even consider crossing this road, right?
Para po makuha natin ang ating overall risk rating or yung tinatawag overall risk, we will use our risk matrix. So, this is our tool for us to be able to quantify the likelihood and the consequence or the severity. So, it can be, different po yung ginagamit ng mga risk matrix sa iba't ibang organization or establishment. So, it will depend sa ating establishment kung anong risk matrix po ang gagamitin. So, what you see in our slide is a 5x5 matrix. Now, there are other institutions that will use 4x4 or 3x3. Again, it will depend on the establishment. For us to understand on how to use a risk matrix, please watch the video. This is in connection with the first video that you have watched earlier.
A simple way of visualizing this and figuring out the overall level of risk is by using a risk matrix. In a risk matrix, information about consequence and likelihood can be used to determine the overall level of risk. Let's have a look at a simple risk matrix. A risk matrix is basically a table or grid with a measure of likelihood on one side and consequence on the other, graded from low to high. The combination of the two, which is the overall level of risk, can be categorized as low, medium, or high, and color-coded. So let's get back to our example. In the scenario in which there are bikes traveling very infrequently, the likelihood is low and the consequence is low. Therefore, the overall risk is low. When there are more bikes, the likelihood is high but the consequence is still low, and therefore the overall risk is medium. Let's consider the truck now. In the scenario where trucks are infrequent, the likelihood of a crash is low but the consequence is high. The overall risk is medium. And if it's a busy truck route, the likelihood and consequence are both high, and therefore the overall risk is high. So that's how a risk matrix can be used to determine the overall level of risk using an assessment of likelihood and consequence. There are many different types of matrices in use with varying degrees of complexity. They can have many categories and different grades of risk. They may also have different ways of defining categories of likelihood and consequence. For example, a high likelihood may mean that it's expected to occur in most circumstances, and a low likelihood may mean that it may occur only very rarely, such as once in 100 years. With consequence, a high consequence may mean multiple deaths, and a low consequence may mean only minor injuries. So, the risk matrix and the categories that are used can vary, and therefore should be relevant to the situation and context in which the risk assessment is done. Regardless of this, risk matrices follow the same principle. Although risk matrices have their limitations, such as being subjective, not being consistently interpreted, and not taking time frames into consideration, they are a useful and practical tool to categorize risk. And that's an introduction to risk and how to use and interpret a risk matrix.
So this is an example of a risk matrix. Papansin niyo po, this is a 5x5 matrix. Meaning po, may 5 cells sa kanyang x-axis or the horizontal at may 5 cells din po sa y-axis or the vertical. Now, the cells are numbered 1 to 5. Yung scoring po nila sa baba. This depicts the consequences or the severity. Now, 1 to 5 din po ang scoring sa ating likelihood or the probability. And if you multiply the likelihood and the consequences, the total or the overall risk rating, that would be the risk, rating po natin. Okay? Then, mapapansin din po natin na may 3 kulay sa ating risk matrix. Green, yellow, and red. Okay? So, madali po nating makita whether the hazard and the risk is a low risk, medium, or high. So, if your overall risk rating is scored 1 to 6, meaning po, ang ating risk is low. If it is scored naman po from 8 to 15, ang ating color po natin is yellow. So, the risk is high priority or medium. Then, if your risk rating will equal to 16 to 25, so that would be a work stoppage order or high risk po ang ating hazard. So, you may not follow this risk matrix. If you have your own risk matrix in your establishment, then you will use it. So, depende po kung anong risk matrix na gagamitin po ng ating company. Ang importante ay marunong po tayong gumamit. So, ang question nyo, ma'am, paano po natin masasabi na yan po ay 2 or we will score it as a 5? No? So, we will quantify po that. We will make parameters. Okay? So, let's start with the horizontal or yung consequence. Okay? So, we will score it as 1 in terms of the injury if it is just a first aid case. Meaning po, ang ating worker is pupunta lang po ng clinic, lapatan po siya or gagawan, perform a first aid on him or her, and the worker can go back to the job. Or so hindi po siya nag-leave or kailangan ng recovery for him or her to be able to go back to work. So, we will score it as 1. For 2, ang nalagay po natin is a temporary total disability. So, in this case po, kailangan na po natin na mag-recover either in the hospital or at home. But, after the recovery period, we are expected to have full function because this is just a temporary case. Pero while you are doing the recovery or undergoing the recovery period is you are totally disabled. You are not able to do the job. Example po na case nito is fracture or when you have the flu. Diba? Kailangan nating umabsent para makapag-recover. Pero after the recovery period, you are expected to have full function. Next is, we will score it as 3 if the injury or the illness would require you to have a permanently partial disability or it will result to a permanent partial disability. Keyword there is permanent. Hindi na po natin maibabalik sa dati. But, when you say partial disability, there is still partial function. Example po nito, nabulag po ang ating isang mata. Pero may isang mata pa tayong nakakita. So, we are not totally blind. So, that is a partial disability. Other examples, naputulan po tayo ng finger. No? So, that is partial disability. So, we score it as 4 if it results to a permanently total disability. So, keyword again is permanent. Hindi rin may babalik sa dati, but we are now totally disabled. Example po, blindness of both eyes. So, dalawang mata. So, in this case, wala na po tayong eyesight, no? So, we lost the function of sight, okay? Or, other example is the amputation of both legs, amputation of both arms. And lastly, we will score it 5 if it will result to death. Now, let's go to the y-axis, the likelihood and the probability. So, you score it by 1, with 1 if it's unlikely na mangyari sa akin yung harm. 2 if it's seldom. 3 occasional. 4 likely. And 5 frequent. So we're talking about the exposure. If of course, unlikely naman po ma-expose po ang worker or ako, then you score it by 1. If frequent or palagi po akong na-expose sa hazard na iyan, then you will score it as 5. Now again, the overall risk rating, makukuha po natin if we multiply the likelihood and the severity. That will equal to your overall risk rating. So, maklasify na po natin ito as low, medium, or high. So, sino po ba ang gumagawa ng Hirac? Okay, who is part of drafting the Hirac? Of course, this will be spearheaded by your Health and Safety Committee. Pero hindi po ibig sabihin na wala po tayong parte dito sa paggawa ng ating Hirac. Of course, kayo po, mga workers, ang mas may nakakaalam kung ano pong harm or ano po yung hazards na na-expose po tayo. So, in this case, kailangan po ng input from the workers. So, from the lower unit of organization is meron pong participation in this. Even up to the higher unit of the organization. Because in terms of control and the policies, these are the decision makers. You are the decision makers. Thus, the programs that may come from your Hirac will be approved by the management. Kaya, may role din po tayo dito sa ating Hirac. Now, let's go to our last, no? Because we already did hazard identification, your HI, risk assessment, your RA, and lastly, we have your C, controls. Okay? So, alalahanin natin kung ano po ito. Now, in managing our hazards, of course, we would not want to be exposed by them, right? So, dito po papasok ang controls. So, our goal is to eliminate the hazards, of course, but if we cannot eliminate, we can minimize, okay? So, when we are talking about controls, we must follow the hierarchy of controls. First is the elimination. So, if you look at here, meron po tayong inverted pyramid. Now, so this is mostly depicted in an inverted pyramid. So, the highest, yung pinakamalaki na part, is the most effective, of course, down to the smallest part, which is the PPE. So, it starts with elimination, substitution, engineering, administrative, and personal protective equipment, or PPE. So, among the first hierarchy is elimination. So, in elimination, we physically remove the hazard. So, tanggal po talaga. This is the most effective because if we are able to eliminate the hazard, are we still exposed to the risk? There will be no risk. Okay? But not all the time, we can remove the hazard. Kaya ba natin hindi gamitin ang mga chemicals sa paglinis? No? So, we cannot do that. So, we go to the next hierarchy, which is substitution. Substitute po natin ang hazard to a less hazardous or hindi man natin mawala totally ang hazard, ma-substitute naman po natin to a lesser hazard na hindi ganun kagrabe yung impact sa workers. So, for example, instead of using a paint, no, kung magpipintura po tayo sa ating opisina, so instead of using a paint na grabe yung amoy, we use an odorless or water-based paint para po hindi masyadong it will not create an effect to your workers. So, in that case, we substituted although hindi natin na-eliminate po yung hazard. Okay? So, next is engineering controls. So, engineering controls is we isolate the people from the hazard. So, in this case, we manipulate the environment, we manipulate the machine. So, example po, when we when we use an enclosure, kung for example, meron pong maingay, no? So, we provide enclosures. Diba? During the COVID-19, para to protect our workers, you build a mga shields, no? Or covers so that there will be no exposure between one person to another. So, may mga cubicles po tayo. So, pwede po yun. That's an example of an engineering control. Next is administrative. So, administrative control is when you provide information. Kumbaga, ang ginagawa po natin is we control how the worker will work. So, this is given through instructions, training, education, awareness, so work policies, diba? So, job rotation. So, in these cases, binibigyan po natin ng arrangement ang ating worker. So, we influence how the worker will work. Lastly is your personal protective equipment. The last line of defense, meaning po, ang ating hazard ay sobrang lapit na po sa atin na kailangan natin magsuot ng ating proper clothing so that we are able to protect ourselves. Okay. So, let's provide an example. Kunwari, ang ating hazard ay wet floor. Our risk is, pwede po ba tayong madulas? Yes. So, we will put our risk as, or the effect as slip resulting to, let's say, fracture. Okay. So, how do we employ our hierarchy of control? Number 1, can we eliminate our wet floor? The answer is yes, of course. Ano pong gagawin po natin? We mop dry the floor. Okay? So, that is the elimination. Next, can we substitute? Not applicable. So, pwedeng po ganon. If wala pong applicable, we can place not applicable. Next, can we do engineering controls? For example, hindi natin ma-eliminate now. For example, continuous po yung ulan at talagang mababasa po dyan. So, we cannot eliminate. We go to engineering. So, how do we do it? So, ang ating effect is slip, diba? Pwede po tayong madulas. So, as in engineering control, pwede din po nating ilalagay or gawin natin yung floor natin as anti-slip. Then, that is an engineering control. Next is administrative control. So, we influence how the worker will work. For example, may sinasabi po tayo dyan or meron pong presence of a wet floor, maglagay po tayo ng signage. Caution, wet floor. So, in that case, ang ating mga worker, when they chance upon that wet floor, is mas maingat sila sa kanilang paglakad doon kasi pwede silang madulas. Or, pwede din po nating lagyan ng signages, no? Or barricades na, kumbaga, signage na walk this way. So, example po yan. Okay? PPE, of course, wala po tayong PPE, but we can let our workers wear an anti-slip footwear. So, that is an example. Okay? So, in hierarchy, kailangan when we are addressing our hazards, we follow our hierarchy of controls from elimination up to the PPE. So that ends our module in hazard identification, risk assessment, and control, or Hirac. You may now answer the quiz after the video. Thank you.